You're now watching Way Back Wednesday, sponsored by Davenport Auto Park, the ride of your life. And also sponsored by Flores Glass, serving the area since 1977 with residential and commercial work.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to another episode of Way Back Wednesday. I'm Randy Adcock. So glad you could be with us tonight. Got a lot of ground to cover tonight, and we may not get to all of it, but we'll go as far as we can, as quick as we can. I want to send a couple thanks out before we get started tonight, though. After last week's show with the Tarrytown Mall pics, I got an email from Wallace Abernathy, who watches the show every week, and Wallace sent me a handful of pictures of Tarrytown, and I didn't bring them tonight because I'm putting together another package on Tarrytown Mall. We didn't get to all the pictures I had for last week, and most of those that I didn't get to were of the flood from Hurricane Floyd, of course. But I thought, I'm sure there's some more pictures out there, particularly of the inside of Tarrytown. I'd love to see some more color pictures, so I thought I would put out a word tonight just to see if anyone has any pictures. Maybe you or someone in your family worked at one of the stores in Tarrytown Mall, or maybe you remember that somewhere in a photo album you've got a picture of one of the storefronts or interior of the mall, particularly if it's in color. I'm really trying to gather some more pictures of Tarrytown Mall that are more recent, I guess you'd say. So anyway, with that being said, Wallace did send me about, I think it was about 6 or 7 pictures of Tarrytown, and so I kind of stuck them aside, and we're going to add them to an ongoing collection of Tarrytown pictures, and hopefully, if not by next week, the week after that, we'll come back and revisit Tarrytown Mall again. Last week was fun to me to go back and relive all those memories of Tarrytown Mall, and so I want to go back and revisit it. But as I said, I'd like to get some more color pictures if possible, and so we'll come back to that for sure. But thank you, Wallace, for the pictures, and they will get on the air in the next week or two, I promise. Also had a visit last week from a gentleman, Mr. R.L. Jackson. He brought this great little book by my shop, and he's letting me borrow it, and so I'm going to hold it up now and just show you the front of it. I've never seen this book before, and it's actually called Carolina Telephone, The First 100 Years. And it's a collection of articles and pictures and just the history of Carolina Telephone from 1895 through 1995 when this book was written. So, and it's got a bunch of pictures in it. Unfortunately, they're all very small. I did try to scan a few of them, and I'll show you those in a bit. But it's a neat little book. It's got a lot of history in it, a lot of information. And I learned something just browsing through this book. I learned a few things, in fact, so I'll share those a little bit later on. But, I got to thinking about, as a kid, I'm sure some of you did, as I did too, get a couple of paper cups or styrofoam cups even, and put a piece of string between them and get one, and your friend get the other, and you talk back and forth across the 2 cups in the string. In essence, that's kind of the really, really basic principle of telephone. As you speak into the cup or the mouthpiece of the phone, electronic vibrations would go across the wire. That's how the telephone signal works. And it's similar with 2 cups in a string. The vibrations would go across the string to the other cup. So I thought about that when I was researching tonight's show for Carolina Telephone and the history of the telephone industry of this area. And I thought, we didn't even know we were playing around with the very basic elements of telephony as kids. We had 2 styrofoam or paper cups and a piece of string between them, but we were. So there you go. Also, getting ready for tonight's show, I stumbled across a picture that I had printed off, and I had every intention of sharing this picture last week, and I totally forgot about it. Black History Month was the month of February. It's now over. But I had intended to share this picture, and I'm sorry I didn't get to it. It just totally got lost in a paper shuffle on my desk. And we've talked about this gentleman before, so this is nothing new, but he is certainly deserving of being recognized for his contributions to Rocky Mount. He's got a building named after him, after all, here in Rocky Mount. So, Lee, if you would, put up this first picture, and this is actually from 1950s. It doesn't have an exact date. It just says this is a 1950s photo of Dr. Junius D. Douglas, who lived from 1873 to 1973. He was not from Rocky Mount. He was a native of Marlboro, South Carolina, but following graduation from State College in Orangeburg, South Carolina, he taught for 2 years before entering the School of Pharmacy at Shaw University. Completing his pharmaceutical education in 1903, he began work in Durham, North Carolina in 1904. He operated stores in Durham, Rocky Mount, Henderson, and was Henderson's first black pharmacist. The Douglas Drug Store was located on Horner Street, where he was assisted by his son, Dr. Junius D. Douglas Jr. and Dr. Hill. He was married to Lucy Hines Douglas and was the father of Junius Jr., Melba, and Alonzo Douglas. The Douglas Block, downtown Rocky Mount, has gone through several renovations over the years, and it's named after Mr. Junius Douglas. And so, like I said, we had talked about Mr. Douglas before in a prior show. I'd shown this picture, in fact, on a prior show. But I had every intention of sharing this last week. I had even printed it off and laid it on my desk, and it just got lost in the paper shuffle. So I'm sorry I didn't get it in during Black History Month, but I did want to acknowledge Dr. Junius's contributions not only to the field of pharmacy and pharmacists, but also what he did here in Rocky Mount. And so there you go. Hats off to Mr. Junius Douglas. Okay, I mentioned earlier that Mr. Jackson brought this book by to me, and I honestly didn't have the time. It's a small book, but golly, it's got 141 or so, 142 pages. And so my intention was to read this thing before tonight's show, and I got started and got sidetracked a half a dozen times. I went back and started again and got sidetracked again, so I never did finish reading it. But there's some really neat history here. I don't know, I guess I knew I had just forgotten. Carolina Telephone didn't start in Rocky Mount. Many of you know this already, obviously. It started in Tarboro. And so there's a real neat history about the very early beginnings of Carolina Telephone in Tarboro. And so I just want to read a couple excerpts from you that are in this book here. And we may actually get to a point later on in the show. We'll try to show some of these pictures. I did try to scan a couple of them, but honestly, they're really small. And frankly, they didn't scan very good. I was also concerned, I didn't want to damage this little book. It's a paperback book, and on a flatbed scanner, to open it up and lay it down, I didn't do the scan. I was concerned I might damage the book. So after I did 2 or 3, I stopped and went another direction altogether. But I want to share some of this information with you here that was in this book, because frankly, it was stuff, a lot of it I had never heard or didn't know anything about. And the first one is called A Momentous Conversation. And it says, 2 young men sat on the curb beside the Hotel Farrah in the spring of 1895 and discussed the desirability of having a telephone company in Tarboro, North Carolina, when in those days the fastest means of personal communication was a horse and buggy ride across town. On November the 2nd, 1895, the Tarboro Telephone Company was founded as a result of that conversation between W.H. Buck Powell Jr. and George A. Holderness. There's a name you've probably heard if you're from Tarboro or know anybody in Tarboro. Then on January the 6th, 1900, these 2 men and a third, Mr. W.H. McNair, purchased the properties of Tarboro Telephone Company along with other telephone properties and continue their operation as the Carolina Telephone and Telegraph Company. And that was in 1900. That's when CT&T, Carolina Telephone Telegraph, officially got started. And back in the early days of telephone, each little town, each little community, each small city had its own telephone company. And so they were all kind of operating, on their own little game plan, so if you will. And so there was an effort to consolidate and get everybody on a standardized operating platform, if you will. And so Tarboro actually was very instrumental in developing a platform that could be duplicated and replicated and spread out across many areas. In fact, I'll share some more information with you in a minute about how Carolina Telephone grew from its humble roots in Tarboro to really be a national company. It says the 100th anniversary of Carolina Telephone founding came in 1995, while the 100th anniversary of the adoption of its name will be in 2000 AD. And of course, this is all from this book, and all this is past now, obviously. Tarboro Telephone Company began in the town of Tarboro with 30 telephones, a few employees, and $2,500 in capital. At the end of 1994, as Carolina Telephone and Telegraph neared its 100th anniversary, the company had grown to be worth more than $514 million, 3,259 employees, and serving 969,962 telephones in all 50 of the state's 100 counties. Had operating revenues of $717 million. By November 2nd, 1995, the date of the 100th anniversary, the number of telephone lines approached 1 million, and an average growth in telephones over those 100 years of 10,000 annually. Quite a story there. And so that was this article came out. It's a little book, by the way. And then there was another one here. It says the early days of telephony in eastern North Carolina. It says the telephone had earlier excited the imaginations of some Edgecombe County citizens. The first telephone in Edgecombe County was a line from Dr. W.P. Mercer's home near Temperance Hall to T.A. Wiggins' home near Wiggins Crossroads, according to Miss Elizabeth Wiggins, daughter of T.A. Wiggins, in the Edgecombe Story, a bicentennial commission article published in 1976. They bought the poles and had the line put up themselves. This line stayed in operation until after Carolina Telephone and Telegraph Company was founded, at which time they took over the line. On September 1st, 1895, E.V. Zeller asked the Tarboro Board of Commissioners for permission, which was granted, to run a telephone wire through the town from Shiloh to Staten and the Zeller drugstore. The line apparently was to connect telephones at the pharmacy and at the L.L. Staten Shiloh farm on Shiloh Oil Mill. On October 11th, 1895, the men who were organized to the Tarboro Telephone Company were beginning to carry out their plans. Mr. Powell and an associate, James G. Megan, petitioned the town commissioners as follows. The undersigned have been appointed a committee to ask of your body the privilege and franchise of using the streets of the town for the purpose of putting up poles and wires for a telephone system in said town. The poles will be put up on the curbs of the sidewalks and with as little interference with the public use of the streets as possible. So, again, little old Tarboro was the birthplace of Carolina Telephone in North Carolina. And again, this book was published in 1995. Certainly in the 25 or 30 years since then, there's been a lot of growth. It's no longer Carolina Telephone, obviously, but there was a lot that took place, and a lot has gone on between the time this book was published in 1995 and where we are today with Carolina Telephone. So I thought it would be neat to look at some of these pictures. Some of these first ones come out of this book. Like I said, I did try to scan a couple of them, and the scan didn't go too well, frankly. But let's go ahead, Lee. Let's put this first one up. Okay, this is actually Mr. Buck Powell, and this was taken, believe it or not, in 1899. And so he was one of the original founders, if you will, of Carolina Telephone. He and Mr. George Holderness in 1895, started the Tarboro Telephone Company. And so this was apparently a big snowstorm. It was actually, there's an article appeared in the paper, in fact, in 1899 about the great snowstorm of 1899. But this was Mr. Buck Powell standing somewhere in the street in Tarboro in 1899. And as you can see, the snow is coming down pretty heavily there, and all around him there's already snow on the ground, and it looks to be several inches by this point, and still snowing, obviously. So anyway, this next one, Lee, if you will, let's go ahead and get this next picture up. This is from 1900, and I don't know who took these pictures, but you can see that gentleman up there precariously perched on the pole. You know, some of the earliest utility poles that were out there were, in fact, telephone poles and telegraph poles. So, you know, you look back at all these old pictures and you see a bunch of these, what we might think are might think are utility poles or power poles, when in fact some of them are telephone poles. And so this was taken in 1900, and this is in Tarboro also. This is Main Street in Tarboro, and this was the early beginnings of the telephone industry in Tarboro, and of course it spread throughout the state and indeed the nation. And I should also say that, Tarboro didn't invent the telephone system. Carolina Telephone was just one of many individually or independently owned telephone companies around the state and indeed around the nation. But again, some of the technologies and some of the protocols that were established, implemented, designed, and put into practice in Carolina Telephone did in fact eventually work their way into other systems all around the country outside of the state of North Carolina. Okay, so let's go ahead and lead to the next one then. This is a picture of the first switchboard, and it was a man from Rocky Mount, Mr. S.K. Fountain. And Mr. S.K. Fountain actually himself put together the first telephone company in Rocky Mount. And before there was a Carolina Telephone in Rocky Mount, there was actually the Home Telephone Company. It was called the Home Telephone and Telegraph Company, actually. And I went back and looked, and I found references to the Home Telephone and Telegraph Company as early as 1908, 1909 in the city directories, up through the 1920s. In fact, it was still referred to as the Home Telephone and Telegraph Company. It was only, I think, in 1930 when I first saw a listing in Rocky Mount for Carolina Telephone. So sometime between the late 1920s and 1930, Carolina Telephone took over the local Rocky Mount operation, or telephone operation, which was called the Home Telephone and Telegraph Company. And that same thing happened, by the way, all over the state. Carolina Telephone took over independent companies in Wilson, for example, in Fayetteville, Smithfield, Snow Hill. There were several smaller companies that kind of got swallowed up, if you will, by Carolina Telephone. And so, and that brought in new ideas, it brought in new suggestions, ways of doing things, because they had all been independent operations. And so as they all became under one umbrella and ideas merged together, I think it was probably well, without a doubt, it was a good thing, because it, allowed the different mindsets who put these systems together to collaborate and help grow the system. I tell you what, I see it's time for our first commercial break. Lee, bring it back to me. When we come back from the break, folks, we're going to take a look at some more pictures. We'll talk a little more about this book. I'll show you some pictures. We'll try to take a look at some of these pictures. I don't know if they can zoom in and get a better picture, and we'll try that when I come back from the break. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more Way Back Wednesday.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service, we offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family, and we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
Hello, my name is Gus Tullis of Gus Tullis Insurance, and I've been helping people with their insurance needs for well over 20 years. If you're turning 65 or you're currently on Medicare, I can help you make the best decision for the Medicare plan that will suit your needs. Don't wait. Call me today. I'll answer any question you have. 252-937-6913. Looking forward to hearing from you.
When faced with special care needs for elderly or disabled loved ones, families want compassionate, comforting care. That's Tender Touch Home Care Services' goal, providing the level of care we would expect for our own. With over 10 years of home care excellence, Tender Touch provides an array of services that keeps your loved one at home. From personal care, light housekeeping, errands, and meal preparation, to our private duty care program, which combines all of our home care offerings in one package.
Tender Touch Home Care Services, where your needs are our concern.
back. We're back. Folks, if you're just tuning in, you're watching Way Back Wednesday. I'm Randy Adcox. I'd love to hear from you. 407-1111 is the number. We're talking about Carolina Telephone tonight. And, you know, the telephone industry as a whole has gone through a myriad of changes and technological advancements over the years. The internet has single-handedly literally revamped the entire telephone system all over the world, for that matter. I had a conversation several years ago with a CT&T, or Carolina Telephone employee. This was back in the 90s, and he was telling me then, he said, the infrastructure that's in place now, the wiring and the equipment and everything that the telephone company has been using for years to allow for telephone communication to take place, was never intended to also accommodate internet traffic. And so he said, and this was back in the 90s, and he was telling me, we're having to kind of, rebuild our system from the ground up on a continual basis. And that's an ongoing thing, by the way. I mean, the idea that you'll ever get to a point where you're through building infrastructure to support technology like the internet is just a myth. It's not going to happen. I mean, as new technology and as new types of internet activity are brought online, these companies like the phone company and the cable company and so forth are being forced to revamp their system, to rebuild their system, and it's just an ongoing struggle. And I say that because both Carolina Telephone and Southern Link here locally take a lot of grief. Some of it's earned, by the way. I'm not saying they don't deserve some scrutiny, but they take a lot of grief that's frankly not always their fault. And that's a prime example. Their system, the wiring, the cabling, the equipment is stressed to the max, especially now with the high-speed internet services that are out there, and so many are doing so much over the internet, home use and business use especially. So anyway, I'd be remiss if I didn't go back and talk a little bit about Alexander Graham Bell. And there's a really neat short article here in this book. So I want to share this with you before we go on any further. It said, telephony's beginnings were not auspicious. Alexander Graham Bell patented his invention in 1876 at the age of 29 years old. The patent followed years of experimentation by Bell alone and later with an assistant, Thomas A. Watson. Bell's interest reflected his long family background in the art of speech and speech therapy for the deaf. At the telephone's first public showing at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, where it had to compete with such wonders as the first electric light, the first grain binder, the first printed telegraph, it achieved temporary success when the Emperor of Brazil declared the telephone the most wonderful invention he had ever seen or heard. "My God, it talks," he exclaimed when Bell demonstrated it. The business world took little notice of the telephone, and the general public showed amused indifference. Most people considered it a scientific toy, and the newspapers ridiculed it. Prior to Bell's invention, for example, the Baltimore County Advocate of Towson, Maryland, reported the arrest of a man in New York for attempting to extort funds from ignorant and superstitious people by exhibiting a device which, he says, will convey the human voice any distance over metallic wires. Well-informed people know that it is impossible to transmit the human voice over wires. The authorities who apprehended this criminal are to be congratulated, and it is hoped that his punishment will be prompt and fitting. Bell, Watson, and two other men formed a trusteeship in 1877, and that same year, Bell was granted a second patent. In 1880, the American Bell Telephone Company was organized. So, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, as we all know from elementary school. But it was a really basic idea then, getting back to the 2 cups and a string. It's rudimentary by today's standards, but it was a starting point. And over the years, with these individual telephone companies all over the country popping up everywhere, there were different ways of doing things. Different switch type designs were being developed. Different types of wires are being tried out for use stringing between cities and so forth. And so there was, as I said, an ongoing collaboration of ideas. And as these larger companies gobbled up these smaller companies, that helped the process to expand and to create new technologies. So, okay, Lee, let's go back to our pictures and let's jump on to our next one. This is dated, this is one of the ones that I tried to scan and got out of this book, so I apologize. It's not great quality, but this shows some of the really, really early telephone buildings. The one at the top is Wilson from 1912, and then the next one is Farmville, and then the Greenville offices, and these are all in the 1912 to 1915 time frame. I'm not sure how many of these buildings are still standing. I'm not sure if any of them are, frankly, but that just kind of gives you an idea. Back in the early 1900s, when banks and insurance companies were typically the largest companies in town, the telephone companies very quickly gained a foothold in business and industry, and so they quickly gathered a large enough customer base and needed the size of buildings that they ended up building, and many of these buildings were later replaced with even larger buildings. We'll get to some of that here shortly. Okay, Lee, let's go to the next one then if we could. This is from Fayetteville, Southern Pines, and Kinston telephone offices in the 1920s. And again, I apologize, these pictures aren't real great, but the point is, you notice these are basically really small operations at this point. And again, most of these cities in the early 1900s had a few thousand customers at most. Rural telephone technology was still very sporadic. It was, for the most part, business executives, doctors, professional people in the immediate vicinity of the cities and towns. And so as you left the city limits and went out to rural sections, you found less and less telephone service. And that was a big achievement in the 30s and 40s when the telephone companies started going out and stringing wire and equipment up and down the rural roads and providing telephone service to the millions of people who previously didn't have access to it. But these were very small offices initially in the 1920s. As I said, it didn't take a lot of space to provide service to the limited number of customers that each one of these operations had. And so in later years, as they expanded and got more customers, they would increase not only the size of operation, but the buildings to match. Okay, Lee. So in 1947, we'll jump forward here a bit. In 1947, there was a major strike. Some of you may remember this. And Lee, if you want to go ahead and put the next picture up. This is from, I almost skipped over one. Let's do that first. This is actually from I got out a little bit out of, this is also from the 1915 to 1920 time frame here, I think it is. And this is actually Wilson, Smithfield, and Washington offices. So by this point, and these pictures aren't real great. They were taken back very early, and so the original picture may have been better, but after it was reprinted in this book, quality's a little grainy. But anyway, these are from roughly 1920, I think, 1915, and just three different views of three different offices. Again, Wilson, Smithfield, and Washington. So, okay, now, in 1947, as I said, there was Bell Telephone had a major strike. And this ad appeared here locally, all over the state, in fact, and basically what it says that, the Bell system strike should not affect local service. And got to remember, too, there wasn't an awful lot of long-distance calling that took place back in the 40s. There were some, obviously, but the majority of the phone calls were local, person-to-person, business-to-business. But anyway, this ad came out, and it covered all these cities you see down below. Oh, God, I can't even read some of them from here. It's not great type, but Fayetteville and Maxton, Greenville, Morehead City, New Bern, Farmville, Roanoke Rapids. I mean, it was probably a couple, 3 dozen cities there that were all serviced by Carolina Telephone. And so they put out this bulk ad that said, hey, look, Bell Telephone is on strike, but we're going to still provide service to you. And so long distance calls were affected, but local service carried on without being interrupted by Carolina Telephone. Okay. All right, Lee, fast forward a bit here to 1949, and this was when CT&T's local Rocky Mount office was constructed, And this is actually a picture, Waters Brothers Contracting, believe it or not, here lately. We've talked about them in prior shows. Now they primarily do metal fabrication work. But at one time they did air conditioning work, heating and air, I should say, certainly duct work. And this is a picture of the interior air conditioning ducts in one of the machine rooms that were fabricated and installed by Waters Brothers in the new Carolina Telephone building in 1949. So the next picture, Lee, if you would, go ahead and put that up for us. This next picture is actually a picture of the front view of the new, and of course this is from 1949, the new Carolina Telephone and Telegraph building. And of course, if you watch the show regularly, you know we've talked about how when a new business opened up or a business expanded into a new business, it was a big deal, and there were several, 2 or 3 full-page ads that I ran across where local businesses who had participated and been instrumental in getting this building erected and constructed and operational all placed ads basically congratulating Carolina Telephone on their new building. And Waters Brothers Contracting, this was a big job for them, obviously. They put the roof on this building, they put the duct work in for all the heating and air conditioning system and so forth. And so, but this picture was just the front of the building in 1949, and it was in September, by the way, September 1949, when this new building was erected and Carolina Telephone moved into it. Previously, they were in another location. This was, I think, at 147 North Main Street. They were at 143 up to the time this building here was built. And so, anyway, 1949, they moved into this building here. The next building, I think, Lee, is a picture of the roof. Go ahead and pull that up if you would. And there you go. Yep. And this is it's just the roof. Someone got up on top of the roof. I would guess perhaps either a telegram reporter or perhaps even someone from Waters Brothers, but they took a picture of the roof because Waters Brothers put the roof on the Carolina Telephone building, on this new building in 1949. So not great quality picture there, but again, this was the kind of publicity that local businesses were able to attain whenever something, and this was obviously a brand new, big modern building. And so I've not seen any numbers. I think it's safe to say it was probably tens of thousands of dollars, perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars, which in 1949 was a tremendous amount of money. But there were several businesses that participated, obviously, in getting this building together and erected and operational. But these were the only 3 pictures that I found that showed that building. And coincidentally, they also mentioned that Waters Brothers was involved in the construction of it. Okay, so let's see here where we are, Lee. That would be number 11, I guess. Okay, so in 1958, now this was something that surprised me. 1958, Carolina Telephone introduced mobile telephone service in Rocky Mount. The first person I ever knew with a mobile telephone was a cousin of mine, and he actually was working for a building contractor at the time, and his boss provided him a company vehicle, and it had a phone in it. And that was the first person that I personally knew that had a phone in their vehicle. And that was in the 70s, I believe it was, maybe late 60s, early 70s. But mobile telephone service was actually available in Rocky Mount in 1958. And this was a quality roofing service. I'm guessing these are probably competitors for Waters Brothers at the time. But in any case, this gentleman here was the first one in Rocky Mount to get a mobile phone in his vehicle. And this happened in February of 1958 when Quality Roofing became the first local customer to get mobile telephone service in their vehicle. So how about that? Who knew? Okay. Fast forward a few years to 1970, and in 1970, the gentleman there on the left-hand side, many of you remember him, and Mayor, Fred Turney's there, second from the left, from the right. But in any case, This was actually when a new telephone store opened up here in Rocky Mount. And it's kind of hard to tell, but each one of these gentlemen is holding a different style of telephone. And this was certainly something that happened all over. I remember, this was in the Kmart Plaza, by the way, where this store was located. But you could go in there and they had a selection of phones you could pick out for your home or business. And you could buy them outright. I think there was also an option to lease the phones. And you notice at this time, these are all rotary dial phones. And I'm not exactly sure that touch tone dialing might not have already been available by then, but these were all 3 rotary dial phones, which I thought was kind of unusual. But in any case, maybe someone remembers when touch tone dialing came into existence. But anyway, this was from 1970, and it's when the Carolina Telephone opened up their store over in the Kmart Plaza. And anyway, I tell you what, I see we're almost time for our next commercial break. So bring it back to me. Let's go ahead and take this next commercial break. When we come back, we've got some more images to show you from the CT&T growth and expansion over the years. We'll try to get back into this book a little bit and show you some more pictures here. Like I said, there's great photographs in here, but they're just kind of small. And it may be difficult to get them on your screen, but we'll see what we can do. Don't go anywhere, folks. We'll be right back with more Way Back Wednesday.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service. We offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family. And we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
Hello, my name is Gus Tullis of Gus Tullis Insurance, and I've been helping people with their insurance needs for well over 20 years. If you're turning 65 or you're currently on Medicare, I can help you make the best decision for the Medicare plan that will suit your needs. Don't wait. Call me today. I'll answer any question you have. 252-937-6913. Looking forward to hearing from you.
When faced with special care needs for elderly or disabled loved ones, families want compassionate, comforting care. That's Tender Touch Home Care Services' goal, providing the level of care we would expect for our own. With over 10 years of home care excellence, Tender Touch provides an array of services that keeps your loved one at home. From personal care, light housekeeping, errands, and meal preparation, to our private duty care program, which combines all of our home care offerings in one package.
Tender Touch Home Care Services, where your needs are our concern.
We're back. Folks, we're talking about Carolina Telephone and its progress over the years, from its early humble beginnings in Tarboro up through the present day offerings from what is now called Lumens, I think it is now. CenturyLink up until very recently now Lumens. During the break, I was browsing through this book and I come across another neat little article that mentions a couple names that I mentioned earlier also, but I wanted to kind of share some of this with you. This talks about some early pioneers, excuse me, in the telephone industry. It says the first telephone exchange in eastern North Carolina was installed September 20th, 1879 in the rear of Western Union's office in Raleigh. This exchange lasted about a year before it was discontinued, and on April the 1st of 1882, Southern Bell Telephone and Telegraph Company put into operation in Raleigh a new exchange with 29 subscribers. So that was a few years before, almost 10 years, more than 10 years before Tarboro started their operation. Raleigh had a system in place. So it's uncertain where the first telephone operation was established east of Raleigh, but J.R. Porter, who was to become the 4th president of Carolina Telephone, recalled, at about the same time that Mr. Holderness built the telephone exchange at Tarboro, Mr. Archie McDowell and Associates built an exchange at Scotland Neck. Mr. Frederick Topelman and Associates built an exchange at Henderson. Mr. S.K. Fountain built the telephone exchange in Rocky Mount. Dr. W.P. Mercer and Mr. Howard Jones built the exchanges in Wilson and Elm City. Mr. E.F. Young and Associates built the exchanges at Smithfield and Dunn, and the Hawkins brothers built the exchange at Fayetteville. So again, these little individual telephone companies, if you will, were popping up all over the place by enterprising and entrepreneurial men who had this vision of being able to allow communication between people from a great distance. That mentioned Mr. S.K. Fountain. On the next page, it talks a little more about Mr. Fountain, and it said another example of people who pioneered the telephone industry was Mr. Spencer K. Fountain of nearby Rocky Mount. Mr. Fountain learned telegraphy at the Wilson office of the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, and in 1870 he was transferred to Rocky Mount as a passenger and freight agent. A man of many firsts, Mr. Fountain was the leader of Rocky Mount's first band, known as the Silver Cornet Band. He established the town's first foundry and machine works, owned the first bicycle and the first automobile in town. He was chairman of the first meeting to discuss establishment of a YMCA in Rocky Mount, and last but not least, built and operated the first telephone system in town. Mr. S.K. Fountain is actually the great-great-grandfather of Tim Johnson, who was one of my fishing buddies. And so anyway, I had heard, Tim had told me about his great-great-grandfather, but it was interesting to me to see in print Mr. Fountain's contribution to telephony and telephone service in Rocky Mount. And so even though Carolina Telephone started in Tarboro and eventually took over the Rocky Mount operation, according to this, there was some really close time frames where the operation in Tarboro and the operation in Rocky Mount, thanks to Mr. S.K. Fountain, was already in operation. So it's not like the Tarboro operation came over here and introduced telephony to Rocky Mount. Mr. S.K. Fountain had already established it here when Carolina Telephone came over here. So anyway, let's get back and look at a few pictures here if we could, Lee. I think we're up to number 14. And this picture here is actually, there was a paper drive, and this happened in 1971. And look at this stack of paper behind these gentlemen here. It says the largest contributor, and this article, and there was an article associated with this picture. I just cut the picture out and say that. But there was a paper drive to, cut back on waste and so forth, and recycling, obviously. This was in 1971, so recycling was in its early stages, but certainly there were already efforts being made to recycle as opposed to letting all this stuff go into landfills. But today, when almost everything is done electronically and digitally, you rarely see this volume of paper, anything, particularly in an organization the size of the phone company. But in 1971, you can see here that stack of paper is almost as tall as those three gentlemen. It's taller than the woman standing there. And Carolina Telephone was the largest contributor of paper to be recycled to this recycling company. So it'd be interesting to see how much paperwork they generate now on a daily basis, but I think it's safe to say it's nowhere near this amount. Nowhere near this amount, I'm sure, because everything now, as I said, is digital. And so electronic filing and so forth. Documents have taken a place for the paper that used to be commonplace in business and industry. And it's a good thing. It's absolutely a good thing because otherwise all this stuff would go into a landfill somewhere. So we're glad that that's no longer the case. Okay, Lee, let's go to our next picture then. Picture number 16, I think we are. This is actually an ad that appeared in 1978, and it was a CT&T campaign, global campaign. That's Peter Graves there, second from the left. The gentleman to the far left is Mr. Gene Lewis, here locally of Lewis Advertising Agency. Lewis Advertising was an advertising firm that dealt with Carolina Telephone and provided some advertising for them. And so that's Mr. Gene Lewis there on the left, and Peter Graves, second from the left. The other two gentlemen are identified too. I can't make out their names from this distance. That's a little bit fuzzy, but in any case, I know many of you know Mr. Gene Lewis and certainly Peter Graves from Mission Impossible television series. But in 1978, Peter Graves was a spokesperson for Carolina Telephone. And so they had this campaign in North Carolina, and Peter Graves came to Tarboro and posed with Mr. Gene Lewis, other two gentlemen who I think are executives with Carolina Telephone for this campaign, for this advertising campaign. So anyway, all right, let's go ahead, Lee, then. In 1980, Tarboro built a new Carolina Telephone office. And they put this nice big ad. I think this was a full page ad. I shrunk it down. But as you can see, it says you're cordially invited to see and inspect Carolina Telephone's beautiful new administrative headquarters during a special open house. Sunday, March the 2nd, 1980, from 4 to 6 p.m. This modern facility at 720 Western Boulevard in Tarboro represents an exciting new chapter in Carolina Telephone's 80-year history of providing efficient and affordable telephone service to the citizens of Eastern North Carolina. And it goes on to say it's the largest company in, oh golly, can you zoom on that a little bit, Lee? It's getting a little difficult for me to read. I'm not sure if it'll be clear if we zoom in on it. It may not zoom either for that matter. So, okay, it's all right. But anyway, this was when the Tarboro CT&T built their new building. Again, this took place in February of 1980 over Western Boulevard. Okay, Lee, let's go to the next one then. I mentioned at the top of the show that, you know, over the years, the internet especially has been a driving force in forcing technology. And in 1984, the internet hadn't really come on to focus yet. I mean, it certainly, the Defense Agency's network, DARPA, was operational, and that was kind of a pre-runner to what we know as the internet today. But Carolina Telephone was already implementing new technology and new equipment, and this article here appeared in the Telegram in March of 1984. And it talks about, says Miss Lucille Vick and Hilda McLaughlin and Louise Dixon, it looks like, operators for Carolina Telephone are operating in Rocky Mount in the new electronic operator consoles. And so this is all, of course, solid state electronics. You know, if you think about the old days of switching telephone calls where the operator would have to pull a wire out of one hole and plug it in another hole to transfer a call or connect the call from one party to another. All of that was, of course, done away with many, many years ago. And these consoles here took the place, and these operators could handle multiple calls simultaneously with the push of a button. And so, obviously, you know, everything went much more efficient when these pieces of equipment were implemented and brought online. So, okay, Lee, this is in '84. So in 1987, there was another milestone reached when Carolina Telephone implemented digital switches. And this was actually, I got a Navy in 1986. I went to work here locally doing security work and telephone work. And so I had an opportunity to go into some of the telephone companies' buildings around town and see some of these digital switches. They were had been come online at this time. And it was really neat. I mean, these things were, very modern, state-of-the-art technology, and everything about what the telephone company was doing, and still does for that matter, was continually in a state of upgrading as new technology, new circuitry, new electronics were developed, and a lot of this new technology was due to the demand that was placed on the phone company by its use of customers and the continually changing demands of the customer. It was not just to be able to talk between parties anymore. You had to accommodate increasing numbers of calls, long distance calls and so forth, which is something, I ran across another ad earlier, and I meant to cut that out and bring that, and I did not do that. But it was an ad that talked about, and I think this was in the early 80s also, some of you remember this, when there was an effort to get you to choose your long distance carrier. Today we don't even think about that. Everybody's got a cell phone and you can make free long distance phone calls on your cell phone, so no one even thinks about long distance anymore. But there was a time when there was a lot of companies, there was a lot of multi-level marketing companies. Many of you remember this too. There were companies that sprang up for the sole purpose of getting your long distance business. They would have all kind of promotions, and I remember there were some bidding wars going on. Phone calls, long distance phone calls were being advertised as cheaply as 7 or 8, 10 cents a minute for long distance phone calls. In hindsight, now that sounds ridiculous because we can make unlimited phone calls, long distance phone calls on our cell phones at no charge to us whatsoever. But there was a big push for many years to kind of corner the market on long distance calling, and there were several companies that sprang up, and of course most are no longer in business. I don't know of any that are, in fact, that specialize in just long distance. Carolina Telephone had its own long distance division, in fact, and so you could choose to keep Carolina Telephone as your primary phone provider, and also choose to keep them for your long distance provider, but you also had the option to branch off and contract with other companies if you wanted to do one of these programs where you would dial like a 2-digit number, or sometimes as much as a 5 or 6-digit number, and then your long distance number, and you would be, your call would be routed through a system to make that long distance call. So again, all that's kind of gone by the wayside now. I don't know of anyone that's doing that, any company that's still doing that. It was technology that was out there for a while, but it went by the wayside. And so I tell you what, we're almost out of time. I tell you what, Lee, if you would, come back to me, and I don't know how well these pictures are going to come across the screen, but I want to just kind of hold this book up and just kind of see if we can zoom in and take a look at some of these pictures. This is in 1960. If you can get this picture right here, Lee. This is actually a payphone. It seems odd to think about payphones being there you go, phone from car. You could actually pull up, I mentioned earlier, in 1958, they had phone service available for your car, and this was in 1960, and it was advertised as being phone from car. If you weren't fortunate to be able to have a phone installed in your car, you could pull up to one of these pay phones and make a call while you were sitting in your car. So I thought that was pretty neat. Again, that was from July of 1960. March 1963, with thousands of miles of coastline and inland waters in the service area, Carolina Telephone sometimes required to lay underwater cable, such as this project in the Newport River. There are telephone cables that cross just about every river in the country, and indeed the oceans of the world. And so that's how we're able to call, to Europe and to Australia and to, other countries all around the world, because of these cables that are spanning the globe now, and even indeed going underneath the oceans. It's just, there's a lot of neat technology that goes along with the telephone industry, and, we use this service. And now, as I said, most of us have cell phones, so we rarely use our home phones or even an old dial-up phone anymore, unless maybe perhaps at work. But the technology that goes into providing that service is really fascinating. And here's another, show you about, if you can get this one, Lee, well, this may be just the last one. Right here, this is showing underwater cable being pulled. Let's see, there you go, right there. Right, well, let me get my fingers right. There you go, this right here. That's a machine, a floating barge type operation where they're actually laying cable, and you see there someone standing in the water. But to provide telephone service in a lot of remote areas, this was required, and so it was brought out on barges and strung across waterways and rivers and indeed oceans. So a lot of neat stuff in this little book here. I want to thank again Mr. Jackson for bringing it to me. If anyone is, I told Mr. Jackson I'd get this back to him, so Mr. Jackson, you feel free to come by and pick it up anytime, and I thank you so much for letting me borrow it and share it with the viewers on tonight's show. But I would love to have a copy of this book, so if anyone knows where a copy of this book exists at, in addition to my growing collection of pictures, I've got a growing collection of books and magazines and just things that are no longer in print, no longer available for purchase anywhere. So if anyone sees one of these books laying around, the first 100 years, the story of the Carolina telephone operation, let me know. I'd be glad to pay somebody for it, but I'd like to have one for my collection. So, folks, that's going to do it for us tonight. I want to thank you so much for tuning in and watching. Always good to have you with us. Hope you learned something tonight. I sure did, getting ready for the night show. So, until next week, have a great week, folks. Take care of yourselves and be kind to one another. We'll see you next week with more Way Back Wednesday. Good night.